OG Bros, and today we're going to be talking about the VORD Part 2, starting with Section 5. We've talked so far in the VORD about the strange fact that entities are a combination of similarity difference. If they're not the same, then they have to entail difference, but if they're not entirely different to the point where they don't relate to anything, they must entail similarity. So everything is this dialectical relationship between similarity and difference in of themselves, which is quite strange, because these are kind of opposites, right? What's curious is that it would seem that we can understand processes within a vector as following a similar difference dialectic, and sameness and pure difference are both effacements within a vector. But we also are, and this will really come out later in the paper, going to understand a new vector and vectors themselves as capital S sameness and capital PD pure difference relating. But anything short of a new vector will be a sameness and pure difference that undergoes effacement. And the process by which vectors emerge will get us into ontological processing as opposed to intellectual processing. Now, on the topic of vectors, Section 5 is going to talk about how physics is totally different from chemistry. And yet, that does leave us with the question of how did chemistry emerge out of physics. There has to be some degree of similarity and difference for any processing to have occurred in physics. And if that processing eventually led to an event of chemistry, that event must have had something to do with physics. Or not. As far as I understand, VORD and along, the main stress is on maintaining the irreducibility of chemistry to physics, but that doesn't mean we cannot say that physics somehow contributed to the emergence of physics. But the question becomes, what is the nature of that process? This section's also going to talk about, I have often these great conversations with Lorenzo on game theory, and there's something called Nash equilibria, which is a situation where if everyone is rational, you get a suboptimal result. You get kind of a rational impasse, a situation where rationality cannot advance. And in order to break through the Nash equilibrium, you're going to need a non-rational action. Well, there's a situation in which once you have a vector processing, is the language used of this sector, between similarity and difference, eventually you could run into what you could almost call a ontological equilibria, like a Nash equilibria, which is where there's been an exhaustion of all possibilities of manifestation of a vector, say the physical vector. And as those possibility runs out, well, the vector is going to head toward entropy. It's going to head toward effacement. The only way for there to be continual existence is for there somehow to be a breakout from this vector, from this ontological equilibrium, and that would be a non-ontological action, just like a non-rational action. Well, that would be an emergence, because, say, relative to physics, chemistry is non-ontological. Not nothing, notice I didn't say nothing, it's just not within the ontological cards, if you will, that comprises physics. And yet, in order for physics to avoid entropy, eventually running out and just undergoing effacement, heading toward non-differentiation, as Mr. Eber would put it, then it is going to have something occur which is non-ontological relative to physics, and that would be the emergence of chemistry. So as a framework, now it's all metaphoric here. I'm not saying there's necessarily, like, literally an ontological equilibrium, but and it would suggest basically that because once you reach an ontological equilibrium, you're going to undergo effacement if you cannot escape it, in the same way that if you reach a Nash equilibrium, you're going to end up, rationality is going to be stuck with a suboptimal result unless it can act non-rationally. And that's a language I use with Lorenzo, use it with Benjamin Fontaine. I find it very useful, and it's different from irrational. It is non-rational. So likewise, you need a non-ontological action, and that would be an emergence. And emergence occurs when the processing of a vector reaches a point where it just is heading toward entropy, or it has exhausted all possible manifestations of that vector, and so to continue existing, it's going to have to emerge, and that's going to have to give rise to a new ontology. Say physics will have to give rise to chemistry, and so on and so forth. But what is this processing of similarity difference? Now, we're going to note on numerous occasions that Mr. Bard emphasizes and stresses the need to avoid a general emergence theory. And I don't believe this is a general emergence theory. I just think it's a useful descriptor. of how things operate and process themselves while maintaining themselves. It may sound like a general emergence theory, but I don't believe it is. It's going to be called the Leibniz oscillation. And it's going to describe how things undergo processing. And we can understand it basically in terms of similarity and difference. The Leibniz oscillation is going to be named after Leibniz. And there's this marvelous paper that the great Anthony Morley, wrote. It's a book on Leibniz, and it's going to be describing the on-analysis of situation. And in that paper, Leibniz will describe similarity as two entities are similar if you cannot tell the difference between them when they are separated in space. So imagine you have two temples that are exactly the same. The temples would be similar because you could not tell they were different unless you saw them together. But this is a really fascinating point because it would suggest that difference increases as distance closes. We tend to associate things coming together as an increase of sameness, but really, as things come together, as they can be compelled by their very similarity, which can give you an idea that they're the same thing, that actually unveils difference. So when similar things come together, it unveils that they're not the same. It's very, very strange because we tend to associate similarity coming together with the realization of sameness, but it is exactly the opposite. Very, very strange. In the same way that as you increase difference, you can have an increase in the loss of relation to other things that makes the thing different. Increasingly, it simply becomes all there is. So as difference approaches pure difference, it actually becomes... what actually occurs, strangely, is that similarity increases as we approach pure difference. Because as we approach pure difference, we lose the possibility of relation. And that means all there is that thing. And so everything is similar because it's all there is. And so pure difference actually increases similarity. Very, very different than what we tend to expect and what we tend to think. There's quite a few implications for this. So first off, difference increases as we approach sameness. Now, critically, if a thing exists, it has not actually reached sameness because then it would be effaced. It would not be a thing anymore. It would just be the other thing. It would not be a thing. Things cannot be the same. Because if they were, they would not be things, it'd be a thing. And likewise, things cannot be purely different because then they cannot relate to other things for there to be things, only a thing. And so what this will also mean, though, is difference increases as we approach sameness. And that difference is going to almost be like a magnetic charge that pushes the thing away from sameness. So similarity, if everything entails a tense dialectic of similarity and difference in itself to be itself, we can associate similarity with a positive charge, and this is just a metaphor, a magnetic metaphor, and difference with a negative charge. And sameness is a negative charge. So similarity is what attracts things to sameness. But as they approach sameness, the similarity weakens and difference gets stronger. So the negative charge gets stronger. And eventually the negative charge of difference and the negative charge of sameness push each other away. And then the entity is pushed toward pure difference. But pure difference is positive, a positive charge. Similarity is a positive charge. As difference approaches pure difference, it weakens. Similarity gets stronger. Similarity has the same charge as pure difference. And so the entity is pushed away when the force is too great, away from pure difference, back towards sameness. But it can be a different sameness because there's a possible of progress in different levels here. So what you get is this idea is that difference increases as sameness, and that pushes things away because the closer they come to be, the more it is unveiled that sameness is impossible. And so actually difference increases. Very counterintuitive to what we are used to. But this describes the movement, how there's a continual processing of entities, because as they become increasingly like one another, they actually become increasingly different. So then they head toward pure difference in a reaction, and as they approach that, they're pushed away. Then they head toward another sameness level 2, you could even say, and that pushes them away. So there's an increasing movement. This is how processing moves. This is how things continue to change. And, we're talking metaphorically, but we can think in terms of, the child is born with a sense of separation that compels the child in the direction of primordial unity. So that's a Freudian example. The child is born, senses their separation, and wants to be one with the mother again. So difference compels them towards sameness. Reason has a sense of not understanding what is thrown into, what it is thrown into, which is an allusion to Heidegger. So thus it seeks a theory of everything to gain a foundation for itself. So there's a kind of sameness that it seeks. There's a sense of difference that compels reason towards sameness. We experience our lack, and then we hunt for a relationship, job, or the like, which can fill this lack, and so on. We can view the entire movement. There's just many, many examples where you see this feeling of difference then leads to sameness. Likewise, you could even say, funny enough, like in Girard, when there's a radical sense that two things desire the same thing, they want to exert their difference as the only difference to make it all there is. So pure difference then seeks sameness. It wants to be sameness. And so there's a movement of entities. Everything pushes one another in other directions. Now, this may sound like a law, but really it's a tendency. It's, if anything, it's a law of non-effacement. Yes, it can be aligned with the law of non-contradiction, that two things can't be the same thing without being effaced, but it's kind of law of effacement, where things have to move away from sameness before they get too close, because otherwise they'll be effaced, as they have to move away from pure difference, or otherwise they'll be effaced. There's a law of non-effacement, and basically all that means is that if a thing exists, it has not been effaced. So everything follows that quote-unquote law. Now, we can say the law, it's not really a law, it's a habit, because things can achieve sameness and be effaced, that's fine, but then those things are no longer the thing. So it is a kind of law relative to an entity that is now, that has not undergone effacement. And you could also say, well, what about, a negation? I'm not sure if you get a negation sublimation by reaching sameness or reaching pure difference. In fact, that seems to occur by negating or accepting the possibility of achieving sameness or pure difference, which then, once you've negated that possibility out of your life, you've integrated with lack, and you can begin to supplement to higher levels, because you can advance up the graphic depicted in the paper. So it would seem to me that negation does not come from reaching sameness and pure difference, but accepting their impossibility and resisting the temptation of trying to reach them. And that is what's going to give you a sublation. I stress, Alexander Bard warns that we must avoid a general emergence theory. I do not think the LO, the Leibniz oscillation, of which is simply the law of non-effacement through time. Things cannot efface if they are themselves. They have to avoid effacement through time, and simply the law of non-effacement. You could even say the law of non-contradiction. I prefer non-effacement. Is through time is the Leibniz oscillation. And that's going to give you a description, a metaphoric description. And the paper's going to talk, it uses that magnetic language because I think that's helpful. And the paper is going to describe the similarity difference process of which entities go through within a vector in terms of a Leibniz oscillation. And that will give you the movement that is needed for entities in a vector to quote unquote move around, therefore bump against ontological impasses, and possibly give rise to an emergence, because there's going to be emergent, which has a transformation of the variables involved in the vector until they fall into the right combination, per se, of which will give us the emergence of a new vector. That's going to get us into the harmony, as the paper talks about. That's going to get us into a description of ontological transitions, but that will come later in the paper. For now, we will settle with a understanding of the Leibniz oscillation. For more by O.G. Rose, please see ogrose.com, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, so on, and thank you so much for your time.